Thank you very much for coming to a seminar. Pete and Saul asked if it might be possible to give a presentation on some of the longer term work that's been happening at the Fenner School over the years. So thank you for coming. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that we meet, the Ngunnawal people. And this talk will be about a place west of here that's on both Ngunnawal and Wiradjuri country. So I want to pay my respects to those people and the inspiration from them for the work that we do. So this talk is about repeated landscape transformations. And so if we think about landscape transformation, it's about how we change some of these existing or pre-existing landscapes into what we see now. So for example, if you were to come to Australia 200 years ago, you could have been able to walk from Melbourne to Brisbane through almost continuous temperate woodland. And that's largely what it looks like now, about 95 to 99% cleared. And it was largely converted in several stages over the last couple of hundred years. And in many cases, it's on the way to being transformed again. But this is not something that's occurred just in Australia, as we'll talk about later. I was fortunate enough to do a fellowship in northeastern US, and this area was almost completely agricultural. And this is in Western Massachusetts. And so it was forest, then agricultural land, and then there was the Industrial Revolution. People abandoned the land, and almost all of the forest in that part of the world is regenerated after that land abandonment process. I think there's about 0.05 of 1% of old growth left in the entire northeast of New England, but it's almost all forested cover. Except now what's also happening is that there's very major changes with increased urbanisation. So there's another transformation taking place. Another example is from Hawaii, originally rainforest, then cleared for pastures, and now extensive areas of eucalypt woodland in Hawaii, obviously an exotic ecosystem. And what we've seen in other parts of the world, a transformation from rainforest, tropical rainforest, to rubber plantations, and now another transformation into oil palm plantations. And another example, the Atlantic forest, which is one of the most extensively altered systems in the world. Originally, it was transformed mostly to be coffee plantations, and then agricultural landscapes, including grazing. And now there's extensive restoration work going on in some of the catchments outside of Rio de Janeiro to move the system back to rainforest. And this photograph is taken from a rainforest lodge where you can regularly see jaguars and other animals moving through this amazing forest. So what we haven't really studied in great detail is what happens when you have successive landscape transformations over time, and the link between the previous transformation and the next one that's taking place. So it's rare to actually look at this. When we did a literature search on this, we could only find a handful of studies that have even thought about these kinds of transformations. There's a lot of work on what happens when you, for example, clear a rainforest and you leave a few little patches left over, and what happens to the biodiversity in those patches. But what happens with successive transformations across the landscape is almost never done, particularly at a scale that matters, which is often the landscape scale. So the Nanangrow experiment, natural experiment, actually started in 1997. And this talk is really about what's happened in the 20 odd years since that study was established. So Nanangrow was a station bought by State Forest of New South Wales, it was then called, and it was converted into an extensive pine plantation. And what happened was that in the process of assessing the landscape, when we were asked to do that, because the Nanangrow project was preceded by another large-scale study called the Tumut study, we were asked to assess the Nanangrow area And lo and behold, what happened was that extensive parts of the Nanangrow landscape actually had patches of endangered temperate woodland. And they actually had to be retained, not cleared. So we're going to step through what happened in that study. So the area that we're looking at here, it's west of Canberra, around about Jugeong, right on the Murrumbidgee River. These are our other large-scale long-term studies, but this one is the smallest in area. The Nanangrow plantation is about 20,000 hectares, and we have a series of farms neighbouring in and around it that form part of the controls. So essentially what's happened then is that we've had temperate woodland, such as this, which is now extremely rare, extensive clearing, and then clearing again to establish a plantation. And in 2015, some of our first drone photographs showed what's actually happening as the surrounding landscapes changed. So there are some very important people in this project that have had a long-term part of the work: Claire Crane, David Smith, Dan Florence, but also Mason Crane, who now works for the BCT, Chris McGregor, who now manages the project at Buddery National Park, and a whole range of other people. Okay, so at the outset, this is what Nanangrow looked like. Classic grazed landscape. Sue McIntyre would classify that as a variegated landscape with scattered paddock trees across the system. And this is white box, yellow box, Blakely's red gum, some of the most extensively cleared temperate woodland anywhere, and some very significant patches of woodland left over, irrespective of that clearing. So that's really the landscape around which we're working. And in the early days, that's what it started to look like with the initial clearing. And so still some substantial patches of woodland left over as the remaining landscape filled in. This area has also been planted out as time's gone on. Okay, so this is really a natural experiment looking at landscape scale conversion from one dominant human land use to another. So we've got a pine conversion taking place, but we've got remnant patches of woodland embedded within the pines. So this is what the design looks like. So in a sense, we can think about these as treatments. So these are our woodland patches. The surrounding landscape is cleared of the paddock trees. The woodland is still here, and then the pines are growing up. And then our control sites are matched woodland patches, but on farmland where there is no change in the context for the sites. So they're still grazed with scattered paddock trees. And the design looks like this. So we've got 56 woodland remnants where the surrounding matrix or the context is converted to radiata pine from previously being a paddock. We've got sites that are established in the pine forest itself, for context. Then we've got a matched set of woodland remnants, and they're matched on the basis of climate and woodland type and size, patch size, and then we've got paddock sites as well. So Ross Cunningham was responsible for helping us think through the design. So he imposed a randomised and replicated patch selection process for the design, and then the matching process for the patches within the pine forest and in the neighbouring farmland. And then there were size classes of the different patches. And what you see here is that there are very few large patches of woodland that actually remain in the system, almost none in this larger size. And an early criticism of the study was, well, you didn't really look at large woodland patches. And the response is, well, that would have been fantastic to do, but they don't exist. They simply don't exist. And then we've got these 4 different woodland types. So that's the size classes, and the woodland types are really important for how we do the matching in the design of these kinds of studies. Now, what happened was that the plantation started to be established at the time of the Sydney Olympics, the build-up to the Sydney Olympics. And that meant that there wasn't enough money to establish the plantation all in one go. We used to call it the Stadium Australia effect, where they spent so much money building Stadium Australia and having important events like the synchronised swimming that we didn't have enough funding left over to be able to plant out the plantation all in one go. And that actually turned out to be an advantage because roughly a third of the plantation went in over successive years to avoid that confounding with year. So we've got sampling of most of the remnants before the conversion takes place, and then the birds are surveyed. In this case, birds are surveyed right from the beginning, right through until just a week ago. And then we look at other groups, the reptiles and the possums and gliders, and then we also measure different attributes of the site. So the understory vegetation, the ground cover, those kinds of things. And so we spent quite a bit of time thinking this through and documenting that in a book, which I think has sold about 5 copies. So what I'm going to do now for the next 15 minutes or so is to step through the phases of change, as it were, with this transformation taking place through repeated surveys and sampling of the system. So in the beginning, so this is the first 5 to 7 years, we have about 124 species of birds in the system. So it's very species rich. And what we start to see as an increase in forest birds and a decline in temperate woodland birds across the system. So we can plot some of these things. We see that some species don't care about our experimental design. So the noisy frybird doesn't care. It's just doing its thing. And then some birds are increasing only in the pines, such as the brown thornbill. And then there are other species that are increasing in the pines and in the adjacent temperate woodland patches, or the patches that are surrounded by the pines. And then there are ones that decrease across the system in the patches. Red rump parrot, yellow rump thornbill. We'll talk more about one of those in a while. So these are the species that are being lost mostly from the patches. And then we have species that show a landscape-wide effect right across all the different patches in the system. So the sulphur-crested cockatoo is declining quite steeply. And this bird, the yellow-faced honeyeater, is increasing quite dramatically right across the system, not just in the patches, but also in the pines, right across the whole Nanangrow study. So we're seeing quite a range of responses. And one of the things that Ross Cunningham was keen to do was to start to cross-classify the different bird species in the system to try to make sense of what was happening. This initial work was being done before the notion of looking at bird life history attributes and thinking about sometimes what's called fourth corner analysis and other kinds of approaches was even thought of in this context. So we see here by being able to look at what's happening with the birds in the woodland remnants in the paddocks versus the birds within the pine forest. So which ones are responding positively to both? So it's an overall winner, the white-throated tree creeper. And then we can see that birds that are responding negatively to both, overall losers over here, like the dusky wood swallow, and then various other combinations, static in the pine forest, increasing in the paddock remnants, magpies and striated pardalotes. So you can see that there's a whole range of different responses that we see in the system. So we started to contemplate what was really happening here, and that was that in some ways the pine forest was adding as was working as a sort of a surrogate for native forests and drawing in some of the forest birds and adding to the woodland bird community, potentially then indicating why we're having such high levels of species richness in this system. So we've got some losses and some gains. The thing that's really intriguing here is that the patches are still temperate woodland, but we're starting to add more forest birds to those woodland patches where they never would have been previously. And to give you an example, it's a superb lyrebird. Superb lyrebird is not a woodland bird. Never occurs in woodland, but it does sometimes colonise areas of pine forest, particularly wetter areas. And this was a species that had started to move in to the system at Nanangrow. So that really triggers some thinking. The lyrebird was introduced to Tasmania and it's causing a lot of trouble down there now. And so some of these systems did not evolve and develop with some of these species that have been introduced. So Richard Hobbs coined this idea of novel ecosystems, where you get species occurring in combinations that previously didn't occur. And that's what we actually started to see initially in the system. We had quite bizarre mixes of temperate woodland birds and forest birds in these woodland patches. So what we were seeing then is it's a truly novel set of combinations of species. Interestingly, the woodland reptiles in the patches was largely unchanged, but the birds were changing, and that leads to this possible sense of novel predator-prey relationships, for example. So that's the initial stage of what happened in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Then we had this middle period, and what we were starting to think that we were seeing were this notion of replacements. So forest species spill over and eventually replace the woodland species. And we were predicting that we should see faster changes in the smaller patches relative to the larger patches. So in the larger patches, there should have been enough woodland habitat to be able to accommodate both the woodland birds and the forest birds for longer. And we also know that some woodland vegetation, for example, red stringy bark, is both a woodland tree and a forest tree. So areas that were true woodland would be more affected and see faster change than woodland that occurs both in typical woodland areas but also in forests like red stringy bark. And we should see it more quickly in the more mobile large birds versus the smaller birds. So these were some of the predictions that we were making about how the system might change. And so we looked at this in a paper with Alan Welsh and Wade and others, looking at these different pairings of species. So essentially very similar kinds of species, but a forest bird and a woodland bird. So the two tree creepers, brown tree creeper is clearly a woodland bird. White-throated tree creeper is largely a forest bird, but it does occur in some woodlands, particularly where you've got persistent bark trees like red stringy bark. And then we have a woodland rosella and a forest rosella. Again, the same with two of the whistlers, forest and woodland for rufous whistler, primarily a forest bird for golden whistler, and then also two thornbills. So a couple of our examples, the two rosellas, the brown tree creeper, the white-throated tree creeper. And what we've done here is to actually plot the data in terms of different groupings of woodland up here, and then by the kinds of patterns that we're seeing in terms of the co-occurrence of these different species. So this is for the brown tree creeper and the white-throated tree creeper. The brown tree creeper is in black, white-throated is in red, and the lines here are basically indicating what's going on for these different pairs of species. So down here, for this group of sites, there are no brown tree creepers, only white-throated tree creepers. And the same here for this group of sites. Up here for both species, there seems to be relatively little change over time. Down here, we see the brown tree creeper drops out and the white-throated tree creeper increases quite substantially over time. So we can see here, this is the years since planting in the system. Okay, let's look at another pair, the brown thornbill and the yellow rump thornbill. So a forest thornbill and a largely woodland thornbill, and we see quite a different pattern. So we see in almost all cases, the brown thornbill's done really well, you're in blue, and the yellow rump thornbill has basically dropped out of the system. So there's been essentially a replacement of one by the other. The thing is that there are many different kinds of responses here, and no simple model or set of models actually sort of captured the variation that we were seeing in these different pairs. There were some replacements, such as for the thornbills, so only for some sets of species and for some kinds of patches, and there was no evidence of a patch size effect at all. Maybe if we'd had larger patches, which don't exist, but if we'd had larger patches, then perhaps we might have seen something happening. Okay, so now let's move to the longer term. So this is coming up to the 2-decade part of the study. And we published something on this about successive transformations back in 2019. And I don't think Wade had ever done as much analysis for a single paper as you've done in this one. I'd say that's probably right, isn't it, Wade? And so what we've done here is introduced another group of sites from our Southwest Slopes restoration study. So these are the patches out here to the left, what we call the reference patches. So these are areas of temperate woodland that have been in a farming landscape that are quite distant from the tumut plantation. And the reason that that was important to have those reference patches is that, as we'll talk about in a moment, there's actually a spillover effect of the plantation on the surrounding woodland sites on farms adjacent to the plantation. And that spillover effect can be up to 6 kilometres. So we needed reference patches further away as another set of external controls. So we have our reference patches here, then we have our small woodland patches on farms, our large woodland patches on farms, and then in the plantation context, small patches, large patches, looking at what's happened. And you can see one of our patches, this is Nanangrow Site 28, starts with scattered paddock trees here around the patch. Then there's clearing of the paddock trees. And then as time goes on, Nanangrow 28 is completely enclosed by maturing pine forest. And there's some interesting results here. So, for example, the white-plumed honeyeater, what we have is a plot of the colonisation probability, which is declining over time. So the probability that patches are going to be colonised in the plantation, and then the likely extinction probability over time. So this is plotted against year. And we see that the white-plumed honeyeater is basically dropping out of the system. In fact, just last week, there were no white-plumed honeyeaters at all in any of the patches across the system where they were once common as the dominant woodland honeyeater. Superb fairy wren is doing largely the opposite. As time goes on, its probability of colonisation of patches in the pines is increasing, and quite steeply. And the extinction probability is much lower in the pine system than it is in the grazing system. So there's some quite strong effects. And this graph basically shows some of the different kinds of responses that we're seeing in the system. So the laughing kookaburra basically is unchanged across all 4 kinds of sites here, the reference areas, the farmlands, and the plantations. And then we see other species that are undergoing quite dramatic changes, doing okay in the farms, but dropping out of the plantation patches quite dramatically. Some other things that are quite interesting, the eastern yellow robin is a forest bird, and it's a species of high conservation concern in a woodland context. And what we see is that once the pines start to come into the system, the eastern yellow robin actually starts to do really well. So it's invaded the pines, it's common in the pines, but it's spilled over into the woodland patches, and it's also very common in those systems. And that's happening with a number of species in this area. So what this little diagram is all about is coming back to this idea of thinking about repeated transformations. And what we see here is that the initial fragmentation was the creation of the change from extensive woodland to scattered woodland patches in a predominantly grazed system, much as you would see in farmland right across southeastern Australia in the woodlands. And here is the species response to the second transformation, which is moving the system into a pine-dominated system with woodland patches. And we see that there's only 3 of the species that we analysed which actually didn't respond to either. So they're the bomb-proof species that are everywhere, irrespective of what's going on in the landscape. Over here, we see that this group of species are responding to both the initial transformation, the extensive land clearing, and then after that, the additional second transformation in the system. So they're responding to what originally happened over the previous 20 or 30 years prior to the experiment starting, and then the additional transformation taking place here. So some of the important lessons here is that we are seeing some really quite profound changes in the bird assemblages, but in ways that you wouldn't naturally expect, given the connection between the previous landscape change and then the new landscape change. One of the interesting outcomes of the work was that we saw an effect, a spillover effect of the plantation being established on the neighbouring farms, even though they didn't have any pines established on them. So we saw a whole suite of birds, for example, the white-throated tree creeper, the yellow-faced honeyeater, and quite a number of other species that started to increase quite dramatically on the neighbouring farms, and often at quite extensive distances away from where the plantation occurred. So there's a footprint that goes well beyond the areas that are directly planted. The other thing that was interesting is that the ability to be able to continue to do repeated sampling was very important, because many of the patch size effects and the landscape context effects only really started to emerge after 10, 12, 15 years. And really what's happening is that some of the species that benefit are unexpected ones, often of conservation concern. For example, the eastern yellow robin is a classic example of a species for which there's great concern in temperate woodlands, and some of the other robins are also in the same boat. The scarlet robin and the flame robin, those species are doing really quite well in this plantation-dominated system, but doing very badly elsewhere in temperate woodlands in classic farm country, like you can see in the background. Some of those woodland birds, though, are really quite maladapted to the new plantation-dominated system. So the brown tree creeper has dropped completely out of the plantation system. It has persisted on the farms adjacent to it, but there looks now to be a spillover effect that's starting to drive them down as well. So we find very few brown tree creepers at all in the entire system. And that's an observation just from the last few weeks. Okay, so what's really happening then is that there seems to be transformations that are interacting, the new ones interacting with the old one, and the legacies of the past transformation, such as the patches of remnant woodland and the old trees, are important biological legacies left from the previous transformation that are carried forward into the new transformation and have quite a big effect on the species that are occurring in the system. And so thinking about those legacies becomes quite important when we start to think about new transformations. So these kinds of transformations are now taking place everywhere. So if you're a dairy farmer in parts of Victoria and elsewhere, your land is now being sought after to grow almonds, for example. And so the legacies of those successive changes need to be thought through in terms of what might happen to some of the biodiversity that's presently there that may or may not be able to persist in those same landscapes when we begin to transform them. So I think there's some pretty big implications here. The first one is that we're seeing massive changes in landscapes across parts of southeastern Australia. For example, in the timber industry, we know that there are moves to shift the industry largely out of native forests into plantations. The work done in the 1990s indicated that there was over 19 million hectares of southeastern Australia as potentially plantation suitable. And there will be a lot of pressure to develop more plantations, and there'll be some effects of that. And some of these biodiversity impacts are things that you may not necessarily have predicted at the start of putting plantations into the landscape. One thing that is important is that plantations are not necessarily biological deserts, and the way that they're managed often has big impacts on what species can occur. The woodland patches in those changing systems are really quite important, and there is a need to think about them. When we first started this study, the staff from State Forests of New South Wales actually didn't recognise the temperate woodland patches as being temperate woodland because the trees were widely spaced and relatively short, and it wasn't really in their psyche about what woodland was relative to forest. That was quite an interesting process. That change in landscape context will have big impacts on what species we see, and it's likely that there's going to be further changes in the novel ecosystems or novel assemblages of bird species and other groups of species that we see. And there's going to be a need to continue these kinds of things given how prevalent these kinds of changes could be. So a good question to ask is, well, what's going to happen when we start to clear fell these plantations? And we're getting very close to that now. Are we going to see woodland birds come back into the system as an open system, or is something else going to happen? I'm actually not quite sure what's going to happen. It'll be interesting to follow that. And there are some non-trivial other issues to deal with. So in the Tumut plantation, we have about 70,000 hectares of pines, and we have about 69,500 hectares of blackberries. And this photograph taken on my iPhone is kind of some of the challenges when you're walking around in gumboots and wet weather gear to try to wade through some of this stuff that I can tell you still is, I've got little bits and pieces of it still stuck in my arms and legs a week or so after. So the whole notion of, if we're going to make big moves into plantations, we are going to have some issues to think about in terms of how do we deal with a weed control, some weed control problems. And the very first site that I did a week and a half ago had sambar deer, had fallow deer, 2 lots of not 3 little pigs, but 2 lots of 23 little pigs. I kid you not. Head high or chest high blackberries. So you've got issues to deal with invasive animal and invasive plant control in these spaces, and being a neighbour to a plantation is a pretty challenging process. But there's also this, and that is that plantations are also highly flammable. So we know that young regenerating native forests are very flammable, but plantations are similarly very flammable. So we're going to have to rethink how we do our fire management and our planning for fire in these kinds of systems. So together with Marta and Jeff, we've been writing up some work about thinking about fire in plantations. So I'm just going to finish with some general perspectives on this idea of multiple landscape transformations, and try to think about it a little bit more conceptually, because these things are happening all the time. And in fact, if you look back to places like the Amazon, where we think about the Amazon as these extraordinary areas of massive rainforest, when you begin to dig into it, for example, with LiDAR data and soil sampling data, and even looking at tree species data, you discover that the Amazon has had a huge change over time. Many of the fruit-bearing trees in the Amazon are actually leftover orchards that have then had other trees that have grown up through the system. And some of the soils are changed quite radically by extensive populations of people actually having lived in the Amazon over long periods of time. So I think we need to think about what happens when you first start to move from an initially intact forest system where we have a series of land conversions, for example, to agriculture, and then to trees and plantations, and then into an urban setting. So we're seeing these in many parts of the world. So if you were to go to Stromlo as a good example. So Stromlo was once a forest and scattered woodland area. It then underwent a transformation to be largely grazing area, then a plantation, some revegetation now, but also urban settlements. So at each stage, we're going through a series of filters where species are responding not only to the changes in the landscape context, but also some of the processes that are taking place, for example, altered fire regimes, altered hydrology and those kinds of systems, which in turn affect biodiversity. So there's some deep thinking to be done about not only the kinds of changes that take place, but actually how do you study these over the timeframes that are important to understand. And so we've thought some more about the kinds of drivers that can be important here in terms of how complete is the conversion? And so what's left over? What's the contrast in the land cover type between the previous cover and the new cover? And then how many conversions have there been? So how many filters have we got to push species through to see whether they're going to persist? And how long is it since the previous conversion or the conversion before that? So I think there's some interesting conceptual thinking to do in this space to think about these successive land cover conversions. So I'm going to leave it there. I wanted to say thank you to Ross Cunningham for his help with the design, setting this up. A special call out to Wade for all the fantastic help over many, many years. Sadly, Wade is leaving us tomorrow, which is a huge loss. But these kinds of studies don't happen without the kind of statistical insights and support to really get an understanding of not only the design, but the right ways to think about analysis and interpretation. Some fantastic field staff, some fantastic postdocs, some who are still here, others that have moved to other places. The support of the Sustainable Farms project, because this project is part of Sustainable Farms. The farmers, the Canberra Ornithologist Group. I wanted to say thank you to my father for father-son bonding. My father has now advanced dementia, and sometimes when I ring my dad, even though he's in an aged care facility, he thinks he's at Nanangrow counting birds because it was such an important part of his time. And 3 or 4 months ago, I used to scold my father and say, no, Dad, you're in an aged care facility. I've learnt better now. I talk to him, he tells me about the birds he's been seeing. And I think that's a special thing. Say thank you to State Forests or Forestry Corp for being connected to the project. And there are undoubtedly lots of other people who are offended by not mentioning them, but thank you for everyone that's played a part in this study over so many years. It's been quite an important part of what the sorts of things that we've been doing at Fenner and in a practical but also a theoretical context. So thanks very much for hearing my story.
We've got a couple of questions online, which I'll get some in the room as well.
Yes, sure. I've got one from Saul, so I'll have to take that one first, won't I?
So, a lot of people think about pine forests as being non-native and therefore it's bad. Maybe a eucalypt plantation would also be native. Then on the other hand, regardless. So I guess I'm curious what your be. Difference do you think it makes what
there's been almost no work done on that. Richard Hobbs did some great work on eucalypt plantations back in the 1990s and early 2000s. And the rotation time for many eucalypt plantations is so short that there's almost no time for any kind of habitat development to take place. The system is basically turned over often within 10 to 15 years, sometimes even less. It's largely going to the pulp stream. And there was a lot of chemical inputs. Whereas in these pine systems, what we see is a longer rotation, maybe 25 years, and several thinnings. And we do see a change in some of the bird species as the pines age. Some bird species come in. There isn't really equivalent work done in eucalypt plantations that I'm aware of anyway. Really, the biodiversity dividend in plantations is around some of the things that are within the plantation. So revegetating streamlines where you shouldn't be harvesting, leaving some of the rocky outcrop areas, and some of the larger patches. So thinking about design in that context. And then I think there's some more work to be done in terms of fire behaviour and fire movement. Jeff and I have talked a little bit about this, about what things do you intersect pine compartments with that might might have an effect on dampening the spatial contagion of fire in the system. The question about eucalypts versus pines, probably eucalypts are going to be better, but the rotation time and the other things that you do in the plantation probably have as much effect. Yeah, it's a good question.
There's a couple of online ones.
Sure. Yep.
Still see, and I'll have to pass the mic so you can come through and catch box. So, with over 90% of woodland cleared, is clearing still continuing?
The answer is, is woodland clearing still continuing? Yes, it is. It occurs extensively in Queensland because of what's called thickening there, so natural regeneration. It's occurring after changes in land clearing laws in New South Wales, and it is extensive in some places, but not in others. So Michael Varden's done the environmental accounts for woodland land cover as part of the Sustainable Farms project, and shown that we're seeing an increase in the amount of temperate woodland in some places such as Western Victoria and Southern New South Wales, but an extensive area of additional clearing in Central New South Wales and parts of Northern New South Wales. So there are regional differences in what's happening with woodland clearing. One of the interesting things that often happens is that during prolonged drought periods, we often see more natural regeneration take place. And we see more of the landscape covered with woodland than we did prior. And that's because there's enough rainfall, just enough rainfall to allow vegetation regeneration to take place, but not enough rainfall to bring more livestock into the landscape. So you're actually seeing the outcome of some destocking. And we had a postdoc here who worked on exactly that in Victoria, and showed some interesting outcomes in terms of extensive natural regeneration taking place. And it's important to understand that natural regeneration is different in terms of its habitat suitability relative to replanted woodland, and that's different again from old growth woodland for groups like birds.
Okay. Another question on we'll go back to the room. This is from Peter Langdon. Here in ACT Parks and Conservation Service, we are establishing our newest 200 hectare pine plantation with 350 metre wide woodland corridors. This type of research is really important for us as we're planning how to balance biodiversity and society's need for renewable resources like wood. Question: what do you know about the earlier transformations at Nanagori? For example, the Ratri people managed these areas. Do we know with much certainty what woodland bird species were abundant or rare under traditional ownership regimes? Gosh,
The answer is no, we don't know much about that. Part of the response is come and talk to us, because El Boud is just starting a fantastic project that's allied with the Sustainable Farms project, where we're going to burn areas of temperate woodland and look at the differences in bird responses between burnt and unburnt, grazed and ungrazed, and combinations of grazed and burnt. So the answer is we don't know in many cases. We know that some species that used to be widespread and common have become much less so. At the same time, we know that other species have done quite well since some of those changes. So there's a lot to unpack with that. I think that needs a lot of discussion. Oh, this will be a hard one.
I guess my questions are more for how you observe the reptiles changing and transformation. And I guess my question is, did you observe similar effects and kind of a spillover effect into those farm areas, particularly for the soil and more rock-dependent species rather than species?
So there's very little change in the reptiles. They seem to be much less dispersive than what we see with birds. And very few species have sufficient data. So the kinds of studies that you do, which are very focused and intensive in sampling, give you much better data than these broader scale surveys. So much so that now across all of our woodland work, following sort of Wade's intervention here, is that we're no longer going to do large-scale, long-term reptile work in the way that we've done them. We're going to sort of follow your model and do much more intensive surveys, potentially continuing the work that you've established, because we just don't get enough reptile samples to have confidence in what the analysis is showing. But by and large, there hasn't been substantial changes in the vast majority of reptile species that we see. We don't, although having said that, we don't see many reptiles in the pine plantations. I think the thermal regime, shading regime is just not right for them. We do see things that wander in there on occasions, tiger snakes and red-bellied black snakes and occasional eastern brown snakes, but not very frequent and not enough to really say something sort of quantitative and robust about. Yeah.
And I just want to add that, at least for me personally, I've got the high sensitivities and reptiles right on the edge of the network.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I guess in the context of, we are looking at plantations being a bigger component of our landscape, whether the plantation owners or managers are receptive to the sort of findings from this work, in terms of looking at how they might alter their plantation management to get some certainty. Yeah,
it was interesting in the late 2000s. There was extensive areas of pine forest that were burnt, 2008. And so there was a lot of discussion about thinking about spatial contagion of fire proneness and those kinds of things in plantations. And then that kind of dropped off the radar after the drought broke. And then we've seen Tumut's been hit very hard, so has Batlow. Some of those other areas have been hit very hard by the Black Summer fires. And there's been some discussions with Visi, for example, about rethinking the design of some of these systems so that we can try to reduce the problem of extensive wildfires. So to have a bit more thinking about risk spreading and planning, maybe changing the configuration of compartments or the distances between compartments to give these systems more of a chance to at least grow through part of a rotation cycle to get some wood products out of them. These are quite confronting kinds of discussions, particularly with local communities that are not happy with what happened after the Black Summer fires and wanting something better to be done in terms of responsiveness and thinking about some of the protocols. For example, which days don't you harvest when the fire risk is so high that you actually shouldn't have equipment out there at all? What happens with this sort of mix of private and state-based plantations? Are there resources that can be had that would help to cover both? And the risks of areas that are not in plantation having fires which then burn into the plantation and have big effects, but likewise burning from the middle of a plantation back out into neighbouring areas. And this is a problem not just in Australia. In the Mediterranean, places like Spain and Portugal, they lose 3 to 4% of their entire plantation estate to fire every year. So there's this, and Chile is experiencing the same kinds of issues. So there's some deep thinking to be done here in terms of how we do landscape design as part of these landscape transformations that think about human safety, think about the risk to the resources and the juxtaposition of different land uses. And, these things, some modifications potentially may be a little bit costly, but not as costly as losing 50, 60,000 hectares of your most valuable plantation in one go.
We've got another question online to go to. The presentation, thanks for sharing the knowledge. I'm curious to know your position. Is it better to have farms instead of timber plantations to protect birds? And that leaves where can we source our timber or look to alternative birds?
Gosh, let's unpack that. So I think one of the general rules for plantation management is you don't do the same thing everywhere. So there is no doubt that the lack of profitability in the native forest sector is moving towards a much more profitable plantation sector. To give you an example, in a southeast New South Wales context, the economic analysis indicates that the plantation sector was worth around, in southern New South Wales, about $64 million. At the same time, the native forest hardwood sector in the same region is worth about $400,000. So there's about 160 times difference between the two. I think it's quite clear that plantations are going to be suited better to some areas than others, but the plantation model needs to be thought through so that perhaps we can take some of the lessons from the Mediterranean countries, but also the Scandinavian countries, about how we might do farm forestry better and how we might do plantation design better. I also think that there's a lot to be done on farms in terms of revegetation. So if we've lost somewhere between 7 and 13 billion trees from the Murray-Darling Basin, I think it behooves us to think about putting at least perhaps 1 or 2 billion of those trees back into the system, but do it in a scientifically guided way, which has a carbon dividend, but also a biodiversity dividend, and can help us maintain productivity in some of these landscapes at the same time. There are ways to use science to help us do that, to help us to be guided in doing that, to give us a better outcome, not only in terms of biodiversity, carbon storage, but also what livestock production. Yeah.
Any other questions from the room?
I'll definitely not be able to answer this one.
Thanks for a great talk. I thought such a great talk for the woodlands. It's really what we're about with this work. Just thinking about the enablers of this research, we talk about students, government and non-government organisations that are excited about at school. So thinking about that, we talk about the next 20 years, what are those sort of the institutional research funding challenges that I say, whatever it is, will it be just as easy, not that it's been easy, will it be just the same level of challenge going forward, or sort of significant challenges on the horizon to keep this research going?
Oh gosh, that's the notion of succession planning, I think, is one of the most important things. And Saul and I have talked about this with our dean about these kinds of projects not necessarily needing to take a lot of resources to keep going, but still delivering important outcomes the longer they go. And so being able to look towards the next generations of bright young staff coming through that might want to take on a role without it being completely overwhelming, and helping people be able to think about what are the creative ways of being able to fund some of these things, be it through potentially organisations like Visi or other opportunities that come up, for example, changes in the wings in terms of plantation design and other things that potentially happens with government policies. So I think the value in these long-term projects is to be able to keep them going, but also to be creative enough to continue to ask other kinds of questions to keep the science interesting and engaging, as well as the sort of the practical outcomes. So good succession planning takes a long time to nurture, but also an understanding of when it's important to stand away from it, take a step back to make sure that next cohorts of young scientists have the clear air to breathe to be able to take those kinds of things in a direction that better suits that time. It's not an easy thing to do, because you invest a lot of yourself in it. You want to hand it on, but you have to allow people to be shaped and moulded in ways that they would want to take things. Yeah.
Cool. I suppose that brings us to the end. It's been a nice note to finish on. So thank you very much, David. And thanks so much for doing that.
Thank you.